All right, so as I said at the end of the last video, the key to Spanish success and initially Portuguese success in the Americas was precious metals. In Peru specifically, if we go to the next slide here, the silver mine at Potasí, which was discovered in 1545, proved to be one of the single largest sources of silver the world had ever seen at that point. Another mine in Mexico, or all over Mexico, specifically Zacatecas and others, provided the sort of Spanish colonies in Mexico with their almost sole source of revenue and their sort of complete economic basis of the Spanish colonies in the New World. Now, again, here it operated more on a kind of feudal model with unfree labor, with rulers squeezing workers to extract more and more silver and gold. And it did not really evolve along capitalistic lines. Now, this was due to the challenges in exporting finished products or even agriculture from Mexico and Peru. As your readings sort of suggest, Peru was quite far away from Europe. If we look at where Peru is, right, if we go sort of to a slide down here, Peru is right here, right? So anything that gets shipped back to the Iberian Peninsula has to go two ways. It either has to go around South America or it has to take a trek through what was the Andes, jungle, to get back to the Caribbean Sea. It just wasn't feasible to export agricultural products or finished goods. By the time they got to Madrid, it was just unbelievably expensive. Now, in the case of Mexico, find a better map here. Okay, in the case of Mexico, it was a lot closer to Europe. But because of the terrain, most of these mines were in central Mexico. This is before railway. By the time they got anything from where the sort of major population centers were in central Mexico, it was too long, it was too far. Things wouldn't last, it was too expensive. So really, the only thing they were able to do was extract precious metal because it would last and it always held its value. And of course, silver was the principal means of exchange. It was currency at the time. Now, in the case of Peru, that silver, even still, a lot of it didn't go to the Iberian Peninsula. It actually, as I hinted at in the first class, it actually was shipped to China in exchange for silk. And this was largely because of the growing demand in China for hard currency, since the state had recently remonetized the economy. In fact, it's very unlikely that Peru would have been able to sustain itself economically as a colony, as I said in that first lecture, without the market for silver in China. So what this meant was the only feasible thing to do was to ship precious metal, gold, and more so silver. And it's what the early economies of Mexico and Peru were essentially based on. Silver, which was the currency at the time. So essentially, all Spain was doing was mining money. And what happens when you just make more money? You've probably heard a lot in the news today because of the COVID crisis, how governments, especially our government and governments in Europe, are basically just running these massive deficits. And one of the key consequences could be, although people often worry about it far too much, is if you print more money, money becomes less valuable. So what you get is inflation. And it's what the readings hint at as well, right? Is that when you're mining silver and gold to use as currency, it becomes inflationary, which means the more of it you mine, the less it's worth. So in many ways, Spain was too successful. And this is partly why, even though you got this dynamic trading system, in the case of Peru, actually linking the Americas with the rest of East Asia, you didn't get a kind of economic expansion in the same way that you would get in England much later. It doesn't actually help the Spanish economy evolve or take off and become more productive. But what it does do, as I said, is integrate the Americas with a sort of global trading system. Now, let's look at Portugal, as I mentioned earlier. We'll get back to Portugal. Now, all of these empires were multifaceted, but Portugal was very distinct in its duality. In Asia, at least, initially, it was more of a trading empire. And you can see here, this is Vasco da Gama's sort of first voyage from Lisbon. He goes all the way down sort of the coast, following the ocean currents, as you can see, rounds the Cape of Good Horn, comes to Goa, Calicut, all the way back around to Lisbon. And when he comes back, he sells pepper, and spices for a profit of 4,000%. Now, Portugal was the first European power to enter the Indian Ocean world and disrupt pre-existing trade routes that existed for centuries. Vasco da Gama, as I said earlier, entering the Indian Ocean world in 1498 is just as important as Columbus landing in the Caribbean in 1492. Portugal, essentially, was able to take control over and dominate the trade routes of the Indian Ocean and controlling the spice trade with Europe, and eventually coming to dominate the internal trade of the Indian Ocean. And if you can see here on the next slide, you can sort of see this is the Portuguese Empire. It's not historically specific. As you can see, it's got examples of sort of various trading posts. But if you look at it, other than Brazil, which we'll talk about later when we look at slavery, it's not really a land empire in the case of Spain, which I'll show you in a minute. It's these sort of imperial outposts and trading ports. There is some settlement here in Mozambique and Angola, or what becomes Angola. But if you look at specifically where they make these sort of trading posts, right? Like if you look at the Strait of Malacca, this is really important here because if you're going to trade from the Indian Ocean to China, this is the principal route through which you would do it. In fact, the Strait of Malacca to this day, more money and goods go through that strait than almost anywhere else in the world, including the Suez Canal, Straits of Gibraltar. Just the amount of trade and money that flows through the Straits of Malacca, even today, is astronomical. And it was certainly true at this time. So what Portugal was able to do was not so much set up a land empire or colonize in sort of the Indian Ocean world, but really establish a trading empire. This was Venice on a global scale. It's what Venice was doing in the Mediterranean, but doing it on a much larger scale, controlling the spice trade from the east initially, back to Europe, but then also starting to control and supplanting pre-existing trade routes that had existed for centuries, whether it be sort of up here, the Gujarati traders that dominated this sort of Western Indian Ocean, as well as traders from sort of the west coast of India going all the way down into Southeast Asia. This is sort of what Portugal's key empire was, and eventually making it all the way to China and occupying what today is the island of Macau, which was a Portuguese colony even up until the 20th century. Now, if we go and look and compare that to the Spanish Empire, here you can see it's a little bit different, and we see sort of the other empires as well. The Spanish Empire is this sort of this empire here in red. It was much more of a land empire, even though they're principally extracting silver and gold. The key difference with what Portugal does in Asia and what Spain does in the New World, and also what Portugal does in Brazil, is that the the nations or the great powers of East Asia were just too powerful. Portugal was able to dominate the seas in the Indian Ocean and, say, the South China Sea, but they were not able to dominate or at least penetrate that far inland because the populations of India and China were too large. There's no way that they were going to take them over. And unlike in the New World, all the diseases that Europeans would have had or brought to East Asia already existed in East Asia. Part of the reason the Spanish are able to be so successful and Portuguese in Brazil and eventually the English and the French in North America is because indigenous peoples in the Americas had no immunity to things like smallpox. And as I said, it leads to a complete and utter demographic collapse. Nearly 90% of the population is completely wiped out in Mexico and in South America, and also to a certain extent in North America. And as a result of that, the shape of empire changes. Now, eventually, the Portuguese empire, as we'll talk about a little bit later, will be taken over by the Dutch Empire. So what are the consequences of Portugal doing this? As I said, as we go back to the Portuguese Empire, despite the size and scope of the Portuguese trading empire in the Indian Ocean, this was still a trading empire. It was Venice, as I said, but on a much larger scale. Despite the fact that you still had a lot of merchant capital, it was a carrying trade. It was significant in that it linked different parts of the world in different ways. Europe became more integrated to the Indian Ocean and East Asian world system. And like the Spanish, when we combine this with the Portuguese other holdings in the New World, namely Brazil, we see a global trading system start to emerge. Finally, in that other Portuguese colony, the Portuguese brought with it sugar, something that was already growing before 1500 in São Tomé and the Azores, and it brought its holdings to Brazil. And at this same time, other countries like the Dutch, the French, and the English saw the success of the Portuguese and the Spanish and were hoping to emulate it. All right, so let's leave it there. And then in the next video, we will talk about the emergence of plantation slavery.